Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ranger Gareth podcast. I am your host, Gareth, and I'm just going to start off this episode on a little different note, starting off with an apology to Brian J. Nelson Music, who I forgot to mention on my last episode. Thank you, Brian, for the free intro and the free outro. You are a gentleman and a scholar and a fantastic musician. Now, that aside, I'm going to be jumping into a somewhat content-heavy episode, so my apologies, but for the 11 people that have subscribed to my email list, you are all beautiful people. Prepare yourselves for a not super exciting episode, but hopefully very informative episode. And what's going to be happening here is I'm going to try and explain the different types of land classification in Alberta. And I know it sounds painfully boring, but this can be very helpful later on. Alberta has a very complicated land use framework. I can't really compare it to other provinces. I haven't looked too deeply into how our neighbors classify all their land. But when I look at a map, before I worked with Alberta Parks, I would see a provincial recreation area and a natural area and a provincial park and have no idea how they are all different. I was at least smart enough to know that a national park was not a provincial park, but, you know, how can somebody tell a wilderness area versus an ecological reserve versus a heritage rangeland? There's a lot going on in Alberta, and when you have a province this big with so many different things going on at a national and a federal a national, provincial, and municipal level, there can be a lot of confusion. So I'm going to be talking about Wa'urnaher, which is a horrible acronym, but that's a piece of legislation that designates a bunch of different land bases. I'm not going to be going into the ecological classifications and the natural regions like Canadian Shield versus prairies versus mountains. That can be a different episode. There's so many different types of maps available. It can be overwhelming. There are elevation maps, like topography maps, geological maps, hydrological maps. What is the green zone versus white zone map? Legal maps with clearly delineated boundaries. Anyone that uses the iHunter app knows what I'm talking about when you buy all the maps to a county to try and see which parcel is private, which one is owned by the crown, stuff like that. It's easiest to understand if you can somehow acquire a giant map of Alberta. I had some friends with the province that were able to get me a map that was almost as big as a door. And when you look at that, you can see just how many little pocket parks there are scattered throughout the province. A lot of people didn't realize how many parks we had until our provincial government tried to delist a bunch of the parks. And then we suddenly realized that, yeah, there are hundreds of parks just in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains alone. But one of the first things I want to talk about is what are the land types that fall outside of provincial jurisdiction? So these are Indian reserves, Métis settlements, national parks, Canadian Forces bases, air weapons ranges, which are used by the Canadian Forces, and federally owned crown land. Now, we're not going to get too deep into that. That is not my area of expertise. I can just say that falls outside the purview of the province. The Alberta Wilderness Association has a very good breakdown of land use within Alberta at a provincial level, though. One of the things I would like to break down initially is the green area versus white area in Alberta. Green area is the forested part of the province, which covers most of northern Alberta, the mountains, and the foothills. A lot of people that like crownland camping are camping in the green area. It's managed for watershed protection, wildlife habitat, fisheries, natural resource development. There is a lot of industrial activity and natural resource extraction in the green area that you wouldn't find in the white area, because the white area is much more populated. It covers most of central and southern Alberta. It includes our major cities, so Edmonton, Red Deer, Calgary. They all fall within the white area. 75% of the white area is owned by private entities, and the remaining 25% is provincial public land. And this is often managed for recreation, conservation, and grazing leases. For those of you that aren't aware what a grazing lease is, essentially it's publicly owned land that the province can charge farmers to access with their cattle. So if you have a whole bunch of cattle, you want them to go graze publicly, talk to the province, they'll give you a lease. A lot of protected provincial land, I won't say all of it, but a lot of it falls under the Provincial Parks Act, the Wilmore Wilderness Park Act, or the Wilderness Areas, Ecological Reserves, Natural Areas, and Heritage Rangelands Act, which gives us the rather messy acronym of WAERNAHER. It doesn't get better. 14.9% of Alberta is currently protected by one of these acts, with 8.2% being national parks and 6.4% being provincial protected areas. It should be noted that the headwaters that supply drinking water to Calgary and Edmonton are found within these protected areas. I'm going to dedicate a separate episode to this, but some of our headwaters are currently being threatened by strip mining that is being proposed and currently explored down in the Old Man watershed in southern Alberta. So for those of you that aren't aware of some of these issues, just type in Old Man watershed or Alberta coal mining, and there are a ton of articles that can explain it much more poignantly than I would be able to. There are a lot of groups that are very heavily involved in that, but that'll be a separate episode. The Public Lands Act covers most of the provincial public land, and it tries to strike a balance between conservation and natural resource development. Many industrial and development activities on public land require a permit, such as mineral surface leases or pipeline agreements. There is a lot going on in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. When I used to work for Alberta Parks, again, this episode is not directly a product of Alberta Parks, but my experience is a product of Alberta Parks. And working in the Kananaskis area, there is a lot of logging. There are natural gas wells. There are pipelines that cross through some of those areas. Highway 1 runs right through the middle of it, runs right through the Bow Valley area. So even though Kananaskis is well known as a wild place, there is still a lot going on. Currently, Spray Lake sawmills, they're harvesting a bunch of their timber leases. So yeah, Alberta is still very much a natural resource extraction province, and that does drive a lot of our economy. Going into the different classes of Alberta parks, I'm going to start off with a somewhat unique one. The Wilmore Wilderness Park is the only park that was created by its own act in the legislature. It was created in 1994 near Grand Cache, Alberta, so it is north of Jasper. Motorized vehicles are prohibited, open fire pits are allowed, you can camp, horseback ride, hike, and hunt, and there are a ton of grizzlies. So if you hear of the Wilmore Wilderness Park and you think, I want to go camp out in the middle of nowhere and experience nature, probably should bring a gun just because of the population of grizzlies up there. Then we'll get into all the parks that were protected or created under WAERNAHER. We're going to start off with heritage rangelands. They're meant to be representative of Alberta's grasslands, and grazing is used to maintain the grassland ecology. So a lot of the areas that fall under heritage rangelands used to be grazed upon by bison. Now that we have a fraction of the bison that we had 1,000 years ago, we use cattle to try and maintain the same ecosystem. They eat, they poop, fertilize the grass, and the cycle just keeps going, kind of like it used to. Wilderness areas. These are the most protected provincial land. It's meant for non-consumptive outdoor recreation. No development of any kind is permitted. Foot traffic only. And only 3 wilderness areas exist in Alberta: the Ghost River, Siffler, and White Goat. And all 3 of those are within the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. You're probably starting to see a theme here. A lot is happening in the eastern slopes of our Rocky Mountains. Then we'll get into ecological reserves. These would probably be the second strictest in terms of protection level for the province, and it's meant to protect and preserve natural heritage in an undisturbed state for scientific research and education. Ecological reserves contain representative, rare, and fragile landscapes, plants, animals, and geological features. They serve as outdoor laboratories for scientific studies related to the natural environment. Foot access only, no public roads. And it's meant for low impact activities only, so wildlife viewing, photography, and scientific research. Wildland provincial parks are specifically established to preserve and protect natural heritage and provide opportunities for backcountry recreation. These were established under the Provincial Parks Act, and they are large, undeveloped natural landscapes that retain their primeval character. It's meant for more ecotourism and adventure, stuff like that. And again, a lot of them are found in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. Then we'll get on to regular provincial parks, and they support outdoor recreation, tourism, natural heritage appreciation, and they're distinguished from wildland provincial parks by their greater range of facilities and greater road access, more bathroom buildings, more campgrounds, stuff like that. And they also have some interpretive and educational programs, assuming those haven't been cut yet due to funding shortages. Provincial recreation areas. Now, this is where we're starting to get a lot more into the recreation and tourism side. It often provides access to lakes, rivers, and adjacent crown land. Outdoor recreation is the primary objective. And some of these are intensely developed, others are barely developed, but either way, they are meant to be used for recreation purposes. Finally, we get to natural areas. And these are sites of local significance that are meant for low impact recreation and nature appreciation activities. They're typically quite small, maybe have a couple picnic benches, and they have minimal facilities, mainly just parking areas, trails, stuff like that. And while I was speaking, I actually remembered another thing about ecological reserves. So even though they're meant to be preserved in a very pristine manner, in one of the ecological reserves in my old district, there was actually a natural gas well site. And that's because the well site came into being, and then the area was turned into an ecological reserve. So you may observe some activity in those sites that have just been grandfathered in. So I'm not sure what the plan is when they run out of gas on those wells. Maybe they will try and reclaim the site and then return it to nature, but that is something for us to find out in the future. Now I just want to dive a little deeper into public land use zones. So when I used to work with Alberta Parks, that was one of my main focuses, patrolling public land areas. And they're kind of strange. They are not completely unregulated crown land, but they don't quite get the same protections as provincial parks. So you'll see people out there riding quads and dirt bikes, going shooting. Abraham Lake in Alberta is a very popular example of a public land use zone, or just crown land. It's beautiful, beautiful land that is treated as if it's just taken for granted, which it bothers me because we have such good camping opportunities that are being ruined by people that haven't been trained properly in how to respect nature. You'll have people go out there, leave their empty beer cans, leave their targets after they're done shooting them. Not to single out alcoholics or firearms enthusiasts, but that is a lot of the garbage that I had to drag out of the bush when I was working out there. So a public land use zone is an area of public land, and I'm reading it straight from the government website here, to which legislative controls apply under authority of the Public Land Administration Regulation to assist in the management of recreational land uses. And it's a public land use zone is established to better manage recreation that occurs in a specific area. So just because something is crown land in Alberta doesn't necessarily mean it is a public land use zone. But public land use zones are not designated as parks or protected areas. And within a PLUS, which is our way of saying public land use zone, I don't know how accurate this website is. It says no motorized vehicles are permitted to leave the road other than to use trails designated for an off-highway vehicle of a particular size or type. If anyone has gone riding in the McLean Creek or Ghost public land use zones, you will know that the designated trail system is treated as more of a suggestion than a rule. Currently 19 pluses covering approximately 11,100 square kilometers of public land in Alberta. And without even looking at the maps, I can tell you that most of that is in the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. So Blackstone, Wapiabi, Brule Lake, Holmes Crossing, Kisco, Wilson, and you keep going down. You just start at the top of the eastern slopes and work your way down. You have the Klein River area, Panther Corners, and then you get down to my area. So McLean Creek, Porcupine Hills, Sibbald. And a lot of the areas do have designated off-highway vehicle zones, and I will say most of the riders have been very respectful of the rules, but as soon as a couple people start going off trail, then the trail braiding occurs, and then we start running into issues where trails are getting rutted out and not maintained. People are making their own trails. A lot of these things are avoidable if the trails would be maintained better, and if public education was maybe a little more forceful. But yeah, that's wishful thinking for now. Anyways, I hope that helps explain some of Alberta's public lands a little bit better. Just to quickly go through the mental notes again. Wilderness areas, most protected, and then ecological reserves, and then wildland provincial parks, and then provincial recreation areas and natural areas are more meant for recreative purposes. If anybody has any questions, let me know. I promise the next episode will be a little less content heavy, but if you guys have any suggestions for future episodes, let me know. Adios.